screens on mute, and then during the question and answer period, we'll provide some instructions around being able to ask your various questions. We're very thankful for you being a part of this webinar today. We want to remind you that it will be recorded, and so if by chance someone is not able to stay for the entire webinar, or you would like to share this resource at a different time, we want you to know that we will be posting it on the Presbytery website. So we are very happy and thrilled again to have another webinar sponsored by our Transformation Going Beyond Change grant. And we are thankful for all of you being a part of the conversation this afternoon. We are thrilled to have with us the Reverend Dr. Gerald C, Assistant Professor of Worship and Preaching at Princeton Theological Seminary. He earned his bachelor's in music and worship at the Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. His Master's of Divinity is from Candler Theological Seminary, and his PhD from Vanderbilt University with a concentration in homiletics and liturgy. He has previously served as a British Methodist Minister in Nottingham, England, and he also is a member of the Mississippi Conference of the United Methodist Church. He currently volunteers as a minister of the Village Church, or the church in the village in Manhattan, New York. We are thrilled to have him to be a part of our conversation and leading us today. He'll tell you a lot more about himself. Welcome, Dr. Liu, and welcome to everyone who's on the call this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let us begin with a word of prayer. Will you pray with me? Almighty and everlasting God, you are always more ready to hear than we to pray, and to give more than we either desire or deserve. Pour upon us the abundance of your mercy, forgiving us those things of which our conscience is afraid, and giving us those good things for which we are not worthy to ask, except through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, our Savior, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, it's good to be with y'all. I want to thank Sandana and the Minnesota Valley's Presbytery for inviting me to share with you a bit in this webinar, and I think we're thinking a few others, maybe up to 3 others. I'm going to talk today and in each session about preaching amidst transitions. So as I get underway, I'm going to hide my self-view. No need to look at me during the entire thing, and I'm going to pull some slides up, and then I'll come back during the Q&A. So just a second, let me get the screen sharing going. Is everyone able to see the slide? Great. So preaching amid transitions. And again, my name is Gerald C. I'm an assistant professor of worship and preaching at Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm very glad to be with you today. We had mentioned this earlier, so I'll go through this slide quickly again. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church from the Mississippi Annual Conference. Teach worship and preaching here, and I'm a minister in residence at the Church of the Village. It's in the West Village neighborhood of Manhattan. I'm also the son of culturally Buddhist immigrants from Taiwan, so I didn't grow up in a church family. I'm a convert from a very young age to Christianity. And then I write mostly in worship and preaching, and my latest book is called Music and the Generosity of God. So the first question I want to get at before we think about what it means to preach amid transitions is, what do we think preaching is? What is preaching? And I'm going to simply let that question float for a second. No need to unmute your audio and answer right now, but I just want us to think about what preaching is. Gardner C. Taylor called preaching the sweet torture of Sunday morning. And Calvin said it was the voice of Jesus resounding in humans. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Who knows, right? Or is it a collective expression of the body of Christ joyfully participating in Christ's ongoing life and work? Is it a proclamation that encourages us and builds us up? This is directly from your presbytery. I'd like for us to think about preaching in a very simple way. For me, preaching is proclaiming the love of God and neighbor. At its core, this is how I would define what preaching is. Now, how does preaching take place? And here I want to draw for the next little bit in our webinar, especially from the scholarship of Mark Chaves. It looks like Chavez, but he's just a white guy originally from the Midwest as well, and it's Chaves. He is a sociologist of religion who currently teaches at Duke Divinity School. And he wrote an award-winning book called Congregations in America. And you'll see it there to the right on the slide. It is an empirical study representing all 280,000 plus houses of worship in the United States. He and a team took a sample of about 5,000. This is across traditions. This is also across religious beliefs, so churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, so on and so forth. But they especially focused on mainline Protestantism, and a primary question is, what do churches do? So I just asked what preaching is, and obviously preaching occurs most often in the context of worship, but what do churches actually do? And what he found is that despite what we might believe, congregations are not significant contributors to philanthropy. If they are, they usually partner with a larger agency. They're not especially influential politically. But what they do are these three things. One, congregations transmit religious knowledge. Two, they celebrate the arts. And this is interesting because he's thinking of arts in a broad way. Consider the material content of worship. You'll experience live music in singing or instrumental music more than you will in church than you would in a concert hall. Imagine the paraments and the architecture and the stained glass of a sanctuary. You will witness visual art in church more than you will in a museum. And of course, you'll experience more drama in church than you might in a theater. This is what he means by the arts. He's not distinguishing between fine and popular, high and low. Essentially, what he's saying is the material stuff of worship is the arts. And we can think of proclamation as a kind of poesis, a poetry. It's one of the arts that's occurring in worship. And the last thing that congregations do the most is they host worship events. So these three things, transmitting religious knowledge, celebrating the arts, and hosting worship events, are porous. In other words, they move in and out with one another and they gel together. These aren't distinct identities, but these three things make up the primary ecology of what churches do. In fact, the most time and money is spent on the arts. So something to keep in mind. We're not going to go much further in this direction, but what I'm mainly trying to do is give us a context, a theoretical context for framing what worship is. And this is not simply theory, right? Because it's based on empirical data. And then I want us to be thinking about what we imagine preaching to be. Okay. So next, if we're talking about preaching amid transitions, we have to ask, well, what do we mean by transitions? And here we can think broadly. Transitions might mean social changes, cultural changes, political changes, economic changes, environmental changes, theological changes, right? Maybe the polity in our church has changed. In the United Methodist Church, there's a big vote that's about to happen regarding human sexuality, and this is really roiling the denomination. You know, in some ways it's unfortunate because I think, gosh, we wouldn't have a special conference about poverty or warfare or mass shooting, but for some reason we're so concerned about human sexuality. This is a part of theological change, and these are the kind of transitions that we have to think about in our preaching. And there's more, right? So essentially, transitions are a part of life. Okay. So coming back to Mark Chaves, let's think about ecclesial transitions, changes in churches. Here I'm drawing from a second book of his. This is basically a summary of congregations in America. By the way, I would recommend this title, American Religion, and also Congregations in America as books worth purchasing. They're extremely helpful for pastoral ministry because they give a great glimpse of where we are right now collectively as mainline Protestants. If you don't want to buy the book, or in addition to the books, there is a website. So here, I'm going to click on this link, the National Congregation Study, and try to widen this window a bit. But you can see here, they've even got a report from Wave 3, and you can, if you're a data head, you can really dive deeply, and they can inform you as to where we are right now. So here are some important observations, but more on that later. So what are these transitions in churches? And I'm just going to name about 10, and then we'll move on to some changes in culture, and then we'll think about how to shape our preaching in response. One, the growing population of spiritual but not religious. And here we can think of these persons as disinterested in organized religion. So they're not disinterested in religion, and maybe not even disinterested in Christianity, but there is a disinterest in organized religion. This growing population of spiritual but not religious folks is unlikely, according to Chaves, to re-energize existing religious institutions or provide a foundation for new kinds of religious institutions or new religious movements. So the way that he's reading the data is we have this growing population of religious nuns, and because they don't want to have anything to do with organized religion, he doesn't see much promise in reinvigorating existing institutions. In other words, he sees it as very unlikely that the PCUSA would suddenly exponentially grow. Now, this is a conclusion that he's reaching. I'd like us instead to think about this as a challenge, or maybe a way to reframe our thinking. If we can't re-energize existing religious institutions, and this isn't a foundation for new kinds of religious institutions or movements, what is going to be possible that is maybe counter to the ways in which we've conceived institutions previously? Or if we can't recreate something like the Great Awakenings, well, if it's not a movement, what else could it be to help bear witness to the gospel? Let's keep going here. 1 in 5 Protestant congregations are unaffiliated. So denominational affiliations are decreasingly important. And altogether, those who are not affiliated with any church are the second largest Protestant contingent, according to Chaves, next to Catholics. It's a big group. And again, this may be cause for concern, but I think another way of looking at it is this kind of fact is also one of promise. Uh, if we see that a fifth of all congregations are unaffiliated, how does that proportion then inform our liturgical decisions? Do we learn from those churches that are unaffiliated? Do we think about their practices and maybe uh, be in conversation with them or adopt them or modify them? Religious involvement normally coincides with the number of married folks with children. So traditionally, how do churches grow? Um, it's not necessarily by guests walking through the doors, but really this movement from cradle to grave, right? Within the context of a nuclear family. But what we see now is that the population of those who have never married has doubled from 9% in the 70s to 20% in 2012. And the median age for marriage is 30 for men and 28 for women. So it's higher than it's ever been. So if the church has traditionally grown out of the nuclear family, and now marriage is the marriage rate is declining, and the median age for marriage is increasing, how might we begin to change traditional feeders for church growth, or rethink what constitutes family? Maybe, as Dale Martin, he's a New Testament scholar, has said, family has become an idol within mainline Protestantism. Maybe Jesus, and I think he's right, has always been talking about a different notion of family, right? Making family out of those who are not blood, out of those whom we would never want in church. Another interesting fact, those who are would be younger members of churches or older religious folks are being replaced by younger, less religious folks, just to put it more clearly. Um, let me move this. I've got your, oops, excuse me. Coming back to this. Sorry, my computer, I'm trying to move the video screens out of the way of my slides. I'm having trouble seeing you all. There we go. Okay. My apologies. So if we know that traditionally feeders for churches will come from church families, and this trend is decreasing, it means we have to rethink the ways in which we consider how church growth might happen and how we introduce the goods of church life and Christianity to the public. There's been no ecclesial increase in social service involvement or political involvement since 1998. So here we are in 2019. In over a generation, church involvement in social service or in the political arena has remained steady. So we might think of our churches as being especially socially or politically active, and perhaps we are in a context that is an outlier. But in the aggregate, things have remained pretty stable. So with this knowledge, what then does it mean to bear witness in the public sphere to Christ? If we think what we've been doing actually hasn't been increasing, what can we do to cultivate new shoots of growth? And in 1998, female leaders of congregations hovered around 11%. And although women are roughly a third of clergy overall in the mainline tradition, the percentage of women leaders in churches remains the same. So there's a real opportunity again, this may seem like bad news, but I want us to kind of look at the other side. We need to encourage more women into ministry and to find ways to position them in roles of leadership. And that can happen at a congregational level, right? Within the ecology of our particular church or churches, if we serve more than one. How do we begin to look for and nurture female leaders? And how do we preach toward that end? So a third of clergy are under the age of 48, but in general, clergy are aging faster than the American populace. So what does this mean for our preaching? Well, uh, we may need to intentionally articulate a welcome to younger people and to think about the concerns of not even youth or adolescents, but young adults, to really make that a hallmark of our preaching. Or if we don't know what those concerns are, to learn about them. And the interest in working as clergy has decreased, from 1 to 0.4% to 0.2%. This is a less attractive occupation in general, so there's a lot of room to think about how it is that we welcome people into vocations of ministry. How can we be more supportive? And yet, although all of that may seem to slant toward the negative, congregations remain the most significant social form of American religion. So where's the action? It's in churches. But as you can see, given this data, there's a lot of room for improvement. So let's talk about life outside of churches. Older adults outnumber children for the first time in American history. We have more older adults than children. How might that change our preaching? Uh, that might mean that we can draw upon life experience in a deep way, because the chances are that those folks in the assembly who are listening to us have had rich lives, even if they're not elderly. On the whole, they're probably middle-aged or older, according to these statistics. And how do we really pivot preaching toward that? Or in a different way, how do we think very clearly about our hopes for ministry to children? Do we partner with other congregations? Do we try to develop a kind of theology of ministry for children? The more sobering transition is now, according to the CDC, twice as many people die from suicide as from murder. What has happened in our current era where killing yourself is 2 times more likely to happen than being murdered? What is this saying about where the lives of people are? And what does this indicate about the need for the love of Christ and the love of God? The proportion of white Americans has dropped from 90% in the 50s to 60% in 2018, and births of color now outnumber white births. So this means that it will be important for us, if we self-identify as white, to begin thinking beyond that paradigm and that outlook and that perspective. And this also means that if multicultural worship is one of our aims, it's just going to happen demographically. It's already happening in the country. So in a way, we can, as long as we can get people in churches, it's going to become diverse by nature of how things are changing. But I don't want to see an interest in multicultural worship stemming out of sociology or demographics. I'd really like for us to root that in a sense of calling. And I'll talk more about that in a second. The US birth rate is a 32-year low. It's lower than the years of the Great Depression. So again, we have this population that is older than it has been. That can be a cause of concern. It can also help shape our preaching in certain ways as we anticipate or reflect on our own lives, or try to think in the aggregate what the concerns ethically, morally, and theologically, what those might be uh, for people in a country where older persons outnumber children. And finally, there's often a lot of talk about millennials, or there has been in ministry. I, by the way, don't count myself, and am not numerically in this generation. But if we say that 1981 is the starting point, they're not that young anymore. Millennials are going to be 40 in 2 years. And as this population reaches middle age, they're the largest population in the US labor force. They're the most indebted generation, $1 trillion. Not just for them, but for everyone. Anxiety disorders are the most common in the United States. So how might our preaching think about anxiety? Or how might we welcome mental health professionals into the pulpit or as consultants for our sermon preparation? And even the generation coming up is the least religious generation. And different from millennials, where the spiritual but not religious might still be interested in religion but not organized religion, Generation Z, at least as far as we can track, is more likely to identify as agnostic or atheist. This is quite a challenge, but I think it's also an opening. We can't presume the same theological base as in previous generations, but that may free us up to be creative with how we express and evangelize the gospel. And of course, there are environmental concerns. The concentration of CO2 is the highest it's been in 3 million years, right? So there's a lot. There's the harvest is plentiful in terms of the preaching issues that we can address. We move on. So how do we begin to respond to all this? Well, the first way that I want to recommend is that we root our preaching in prayer rather than sacred text. What do I mean by that? Here, I'm not trying to be scandalous or suggest that Scripture is not a foundation for preaching, but preaching is not strictly an exegetical exercise. Just because we get the interpretation of text correctly, that does not guarantee an effective sermon. Now, of course, in an ultra-reformed view, right, whether we might say, we might completely bomb on the day and it still be efficacious of God's grace. So, of course, I want to believe in that, and I still hold that out there. But what I mean here is preaching begins in revelation, not the writing, but in discerning the will of God. And how do we do that? I think in part it means developing a vision. We could look at, for example, a text from Revelation, like Revelation 7:9, all nations and tribes and languages before the Lamb. Well, we don't know what the heck Revelation says, but that's a pretty clear glimpse of a future of God. How does our preaching contribute to that wide diversity of worship? So wide that even the Christ coming back is no longer a human, but a lamb. Or if we think about pivotal texts like Romans 8, you'll notice that Paul is drawing on Jewish apocalyptic imagery, essentially saying, why am I quoting from Romans 8? I think it's part of the lectionary for this weekend, but Human fate is caught up in the fate of creation in that text. You know, how does this type of thinking, a sort of prayerful vision, influence our preaching, right? So rooting preaching in prayer. This means we have to develop a kind of piety and a life of prayer. I think to respond to the kind of transitions that we've named and more, we also have to recognize that God speaks within culture as well as the Bible. And this just makes sense, right? Uh, we're about to approach Advent, but chronologically, we are in the time after the ascension of Jesus and before the coming again of Christ. And we believe in the living Christ. And if Christ still lives, then Christ must still be moving in the world. How will we take a risk and discern how God is moving in the world, where the Spirit is moving in culture, especially if we know that the growing generations are the spiritual but not religious, or even those who dare to say that they're atheist or agnostic, then Scripture is not going to be an easy starting point. But maybe we could point to the world just as Scripture does, right? The heavens declare your glory. And say, this is where God is moving. This is what God is doing. Practically, I also think that transitions suggest that it would be good for us to preach thematically and to preach in series. Some of you may already do this. So even though I referenced the lectionary, it's obviously not the only starting point for finding scriptural bases for sermons. We can think, well, I want to talk about environmental degradation for 4 weeks, and this is my theme. Or if that seems like too much of a leap, even here at the seminary, the president preaches every Thursday, and he's doing a sermon series on the Beatitudes. In other words, organize your preaching, if it's in a series, according to 2 4-week cycles, or you could think in 3 months, I want us to understand this about the Holy Spirit. Or for these 4 weeks, I want us to think this about suicide. Or for these next 2 weeks, or this 1 week, the theme is going to be marriage. And I'm going to think not only about the ideal of a monogamous partnership, but also divorce or um, living as a single person or same-sex marriage, so on and so forth. There's many, many ways in which you can spin this out, and we can talk more about it during the Q&A. Disclose yourself within limit. So what do I mean by this? I think often a go-to technique that is used in preaching is autobiography. We begin with a story from our lives, or maybe we talk about something we observed. I was in the grocery store last week and I saw this happen, and then the sermon begins. And this can be a very accessible point of entry for the assembly, and it helps them learn about our lives, and it makes us seem more connected to theirs. But I think we also have to realize that our stories aren't always generalizable. Our specific experiences don't speak for everyone. So there's limits to self-disclosure. What we may have found to be profound or like an epiphany may not translate to everyone. If I'm talking about how great it is to be a male in ministry, well, then I'm not serving very well this need to cultivate female leaders, right? There's a limit to self-disclosure. And recognizing that limit then means that we preach about someone besides ourselves. And here, this may not seem terribly fresh, but what I mean is not necessarily pointing to a celebrity or a saint, referencing an author that you read, but maybe this is a person from your congregation who might have wisdom to share and who would be open to that appearing in a sermon. Maybe this is a neighbor. Who are the ordinary folks who are also presenting us with a more varied and rich image of God? And how can we name that in preaching? So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. One question that we did want to start off with, if I may, from myself, is, does this time and day work for everyone for session 2, December 16th at 1 p.m.? And I'll exit the slides and come back to, let's see how to do this. Show self view. Whoops. Does anyone know how to stop share? There we go. Okay. So I'll open it up for questions. I guess we can respond maybe by email if that date works, and we can change it later. But are there any questions on what I've talked about so far? I think we have about 20 minutes. To everyone. Oh yeah, yes, that time works for me. Okay, yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead, anyone. Sure.
You talked about women leaders in the percentage of women leaders. How about in non-denominational churches? Is that percentage quite different?
I would imagine it's even lower.
I think so.
I think so. Yeah, I do not think I doubt it's higher. I'm speculating right now, but I would imagine it's even lower. And tell me your name. I'm sorry, I don't see it on the screen.
I'm Kathy.
Kathy, yes, thank you for the question.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Gerald, I have a question. This is Darren.
Darren. Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned in your words, we need to intentionally articulate a welcome to younger people. And then in another slide, you mentioned the wealth of older adults in congregations.
Right.
Preaching to those two dynamics are a bit difficult at times. My
They
question
are.
is, when you preach, do you have a certain demographic in mind when you preach? Are you I know we're taught to preach the text, preach the text, preach the text.
Right.
But there are certain demographics that it's easier to relate to than others depending on the text. How do you go about that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I may not be the most helpful because I preach itinerantly a lot now, which means I'm a guest in different congregations. But I'll give you an example of where I am thinking specifically about a demographic. A couple of Sundays ago, I was asked to preach at First Chinese Presbyterian Church in Chinatown, so then I'm thinking about a particular cultural base. And I can also draw on particular context, the city of New York. And I also live there, so I can sort of think and set the claims that I'm making within that context. But even if it's not an ethnically specific congregation, if we've been serving that particular context of ministry for a while, we can anticipate who will be in worship.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not, every sentence may not appeal to each person individually, but I think if we have been doing the good work of meeting with parishioners, loving them, getting to know part of their lives, right? One of the great things about the job in ministry, and I miss this as an academic, I see students maybe 3 years, 6 years, hopefully not more than 8 if they're doing a dissertation or something like that. But you're with folks from cradle to grave. Right. And, I'm middle-aged, but I did have a wedding one time for a young lady. I'd known her brother, and I knew her since she was an infant. Now, I wasn't her pastor for the whole time, but it's possible to draw on that kind of wisdom. And I don't think you need to make it so expansive where I've got to say something for everyone. Because I think sometimes when we're thinking about particular folks and how we understand their needs and God's desires as we discern them for them, we can make particular claims with particular people in mind, and they can speak expansively. So I should also say there's been a shift in preaching pedagogy, maybe not so much at a place like PTS because we have a long tradition, and it's good, but I would say in many programs, there's a much stronger emphasis on context as well as sacred text. So, the old adage from Bart, a newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other. Well, a newspaper is a little late. You've got to go out and be in the neighborhood, be involved in community organizations, or just be involved in people's lives. It'll save you a lot of legwork. As we know, just talking to our parishioners sometimes, they open up for us worlds that we would never inhabit. And then you can go, you have the internet and you can chase all that down. Do we really want to care about yield cost curves more than the grace of God? And sort of use this kind of thing in your sermon. So you can learn a lot about the lives of people just from those who are there and then doing a little bit of follow-up work. I think fiction also is helpful. So while I said, we may not want to preach about particular authors, for example, there's an author named Barbara Ehrenreich. She became famous for writing a book called Nickel and Dimed, where she writes about the struggles of the working class. It's very illuminating. And she just wrote another book called Natural Causes, where she really challenges the health industry as a kind of money-making endeavor. And that could speak to a lot of people. How does this fear of death become a profit-making venture instead of our mortality becoming a site where we think about God's goodness throughout our entire lives, whether we're suffering or healthy? So that was a long answer, but I just want to simply say, Darren, that, I think it's possible to think of specific demographics. I don't think that's entirely necessary. What I do think is maybe more important is just trying as much as we can. And I know how busy the job of ministry is, but trying as much as we can to stay connected to what's happening on the ground.
Thank you.
Others?
Gerald, as I think about preaching, one of the things that always comes back to my mind is the prophetic role of preaching. And how does that fit into a culture today where people are not necessarily coming to the church to find answers?
Right.
We're looking for people who journey with them and discovering what it means to be in relationship with God and one another. So could you speak to a little bit about your philosophy of preaching and its prophetic function?
Sure. And I hear maybe at least two dimensions to think about in your question. One is how do I be prophetic or attend to the prophetic in preaching? And the other one is a question about reach. Right. So even if I say these things, how is it that I can be sure that people will even listen? To the first, I would say, I just taught a class in multicultural worship this morning, and one of the students is serving a church in a very, very wealthy town and a neighboring state here. And this person was saying, well, they're very generous with their finances, but not with their time. And what does it mean then to preach to them in a way that can maybe change that balance, or even have us think more deeply about our relationship to income and what it means to invest in the kingdom of God? And part of my response was, I think being able to be prophetic, maybe saying a hard word about money, or about how much time we attend to work and the balance between that and our spiritual lives or our lives at home. Being prophetic isn't only about getting the content right, but it's about understanding our relationship with the congregation. And I think if we've been attentive and developed, it's never flawless. But I think if we've been attentive and honest, and been able to build a solid enough rapport with the people that we're serving, it's more a matter of having the courage to say what we know already needs to be said. In other words, the question isn't so much a question of content, but just the will to state the thing that needs to be said. I think part of it could be said that maybe some of the decline is happening not only because people don't find answers in the churches, but the reason why those answers aren't found is because we aren't saying anything that is actually challenging the listeners, and maybe that's what they want. Which leads me to reach. It's not as if people aren't wondering. I would, if wellness and mindfulness are billion-dollar industries, this tells me that people still have questions about their own mortality and what it means to live a flourishing life and to find meaning and how to be in relationship. These needs are still there, and the Christian tradition addresses them. Do we use social media as a way, or maybe we just try involving ourselves in other commitments that are public, whether it could be something as simple as, I don't know, a running club or the public school, or in other words, trying to carve out, or maybe we're doing something outside of our ministry to connect with others. So some people might say, oh, there's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and certainly you can get a wide following that way. But I feel like person-to-person contact is underrated, and maybe there are creative ways in which we could move beyond the realm of our congregations. Just one quick anecdote. I know that, for example, one church here in New Jersey, the music ministry was declining in the public schools. And so they ended up opening, it was an Episcopal church, opening evensong to the children in the community. And it rebuilt that choir. It became a ministry to them. Now, this isn't preaching, but it rejuvenated the church, and it extended into a family ministry because many of those children were coming from working class families who couldn't get a ride to the church. And so they had to figure out a way, and whose parents couldn't be there on a Sunday morning. And as they sought to serve these families beyond just the children, they began to develop all this other external programming. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It's really, again, attending to kind of ordinary needs, and just as soon as we detect them, thinking about, well, what are the gifts already present in our congregation, and how can we build a bridge between what we have and offering that to our neighbors. Other questions?
Gerald, this
Yeah.
is, you had made a statement, or there was a statement included, denominational affiliations are decreasingly important.
Yeah.
And that brought up just a couple of thoughts in my mind. Number one, why is that?
Mm-hmm.
And number two, do distinctives matter? I mean, do our distinctives as whatever denomination we are, might that not speak to certain people who are apathetic? And I'm wondering, what role do distinctives play?
Yeah, I think the first question, why, is anybody's guess. And to the second question, does it matter? I feel like, it's a leading question, and you're kind of already saying, yes, it does. And then that becomes the key. Well, what is it about the Reformed tradition that can give shape to people's lives? Look, when we question whether preaching is relevant or not, consider that one of the most effective American preachers within the last generation was Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a preacher, American-born, an extremist, and somehow he convinced people to do these terrible things in the name of God. He somehow convinced young people to say, I would, and these were not crazy folks. You know, many of them grew up in middle-class lifestyles. They were educated. Some of them had PhDs, and they thought to themselves, rather than live here in the UK or in the US, I want to go basically to a place that looks like rubble. Or I want to blow myself up as a sign of faith. If we ever question whether preaching is relevant, we'll look at the shadow side of what preaching can do. And where is the Christian response to that? How do we preach as extremists of love? You know, and that phrase comes directly from Martin Luther King Jr. and coming back, connecting this to the earlier question about being prophetic. When in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he poses that question. He says, "You call me an extremist? Well, I am, and so was Jesus." And when we think about the reformers, that Reformation, as you'll remember, happens in the context of Catholicism. Well, what was it for Calvin? What was at stake? Just to get low-lying fruit, double predestination, the doctrine of double predestination, it's only a few paragraphs in the Institutes. But part of the reason behind it was because he wanted to place the decision of salvation in the hands of God, not in the hands of the institutional church. So the doctrine was there as a doctrine of comfort. That might be something we want to preach. You know, it's not just about, do I go to heaven or hell? For Calvin, it really was a pastoral move. So do the distinctions matter? I think they only matter insofar as we understand how our traditions are distinct. You know, for me, Methodism, it's more or less been on the right side of history. We've always been, for example, abolitionists, but we also soft-pedaled with the Southern states historically. It's not like we got it right. But I think ideally knowing that helps me then explain the goods of Methodism. There's a kind of coherence and continuity that becomes helpful. Or the fact that Wesley just wanted people to come back to church. You know, I think about this as an ethic for myself. But yeah, so we have this growing number of disaffiliation or non-affiliation in a way that can produce freedom. And on the other hand, we're still 4/5 affiliated. We come from these rich traditions. And the more that we know about that history, and the more that we can kind of pivot it to really speak to where people are now, then yes, certainly those distinctions can matter. And I think given the draw of something like violent religious extremism, we see that people want order in their lives, but that desire can easily become distorted. So the challenge for Christian preachers is to take that desire for order and turn it toward the good, toward life, toward peace. You know, it was interesting today, and I'll be real quick because I know we're running out of time and I want to take another question, but in the sermon today from President Barnes, he was talking about peacemaking. He said there's a difference between making peace and just being a fan of it. You know, and that's pretty key, right? It takes work to make peace. And knowledge about our own traditions, the distinctions. Other questions?
I hope that there's another question out there, but if not, I do have one more. Is it someone else has a question before I ask this one? It's a good one, so you got to get ready, Gerald.
Okay,
I have a question.
Okay, good.
We've certainly fallen into the traditional church method of bringing people into the church. You know, most of our new members are young families that when their kids get to be Sunday school age, they come. But recently I have a 24-year-old that started coming to worship here. And the thing that's hard is that because people are getting married later in life, there just aren't people her age in our congregation. And she's struggled with that, and I've struggled with that. How do we minister to that age group that kind of falls in the break between the traditional church?
Oh man, that's a great question. you know, it's something that I think a lot about too, because I'm unmarried. I don't have children. And I'm from Generation X, which I think received almost no attention from churches. You know, there was all this emphasis upon the millennials, but nobody really gave a damn about us. And I'm just not sure, you know, because it can come off condescending or sort of patronizing or paternalistic. You know, it can seem a little contrived. But I really resonate with the question that you're asking, and that may be something for the presbytery to think about collectively. You know, I don't know that I have a really good answer. Harvard did some sort of study not too long ago where they said, oh, well, millennials would rather go to the gym or take a cycling class or go to yoga or something than church. But that is talking about a very particular branch. You know, this still doesn't. I don't know that this holds for every population of young adults. Right? That's for the people who can afford to go to the gym or afford to go to a cycling class or take up yoga. So I don't know. I think you've raised a great question, and it's one that we'll just have to sort of sit on. Maybe I'll come back to it in session 2. Sandana, did you want to get your question in really quickly, or there others?
Oh, any other questions out there? Okay, so here's my question. This is a big one, Gerald.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, what makes a good sermon?
I always tell this joke. My mother, when I first began preaching, she said, "Gerald, keep it short and make it funny." But I actually think if it's coherent, that's winning half the battle. I hear so many sermons that are simply not clear in the structure. And what I mean by that is there's no lack of content now, especially with the internet, for better or for worse. It's easy to find. Difficult is something like transitions. You know, so how do you make it seamless from start to finish? And that doesn't mean here's an intro, point 1, point 2, point 3, conclusion. That means there's an arc to the sermon. And so I think that's what makes a good sermon. I think what also makes a good sermon, I'll go back to that first recommendation I made, which was to root the sermon in prayer. We're not just talking about biblical narratives, we're talking about the love of God. And are we willing to express that? And are we willing to say maybe things that are incredibly difficult to say as an expression of God's love? Again, I want to kind of speculate that part of the disinterest is sermons often sound like platitudes. They just sound like we're playing nice. And they're not really offering a completely honest message. So what I mean by that is God doesn't always call us to flourish. Sometimes God calls us to sacrifice. And what does it mean to preach that? And to preach it in a way where we're not telling people to become a doormat, you know, but rather live lives as stepping stones leading to the glory of God or something like that. It is difficult to do that. So one, does it make sense? And two, is it actually coming from prayer, from trying to connect with God? I think just doing those two things would be incredibly difficult, but are certainly achievable, and they make a great sermon. Others, we're at time. Well, thank you for allowing me to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to the next time we'll be with one another.
We are certainly thankful for you leading us in this conversation. This is the first of 3 conversations that we'll have with Dr. Liu. And so we will invite you, if you have questions that you would like for me to share with him before our next session, we'll be glad to do that. We'll be looking for a date in December, and I know that we'll be right in the middle of Advent season. And so maybe you have some questions that are in your mind that you would like for me to share. Go out and make disciples. and bring more people into the conversation. We always encourage that. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and we really appreciate the conversation. Blessings and peace, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.